Next up, we have Laavanya Kathiravelu. You've got slides. We shall also have a mic.
So hi everyone, you can call me Lavi. So today I'm gonna, we did not see anything yet. Maybe it's warming up. But so my talk today is, I think quite a nice follow-on, right? And it's talking about rethinking racial categories in Singapore. And once my slide comes on, you'll see that my opening image is taken from my fieldwork. So I do fieldwork on migration and diversity. And the opening image is from, in Singapore we have these signs, right? These banners in housing estates where you have representations from, all the different ethnic groups, right? So, there you go. So that was taken in Pioneer Estate near my university, near NTU, right? And it's got this nice representation of different ethnic groups, right? So I'm gonna suggest that these kind of representations are not adequate anymore in talking about diversity in Singapore, right? So how I'm gonna bring you through this, at the risk of, the linearity of PowerPoints, I'm gonna give you some pictures to look at, right? So I'm starting off from the point of questioning this myth of racial disharmony, right? So as you all have heard about race riots as a starting point for why we need a policy of racial harmony or a policy of managing diversity, racial diversity in Singapore, right? Because of the race riots in the 1960s, for example. So I'm not going to talk about that because that's been talked about before. So that's the starting point from which the state, I argue, uses a policy of racialization, right? Of dividing the population up into these CMIO categories, right? Chinese, Malay, Indian, other, right? So this is a kind of normal categorization of racial diversity that we take for granted in Singapore today, right? So again, I'm not going to go into detail, but you know that housing policy, welfare groups are all structured around, second language in schools are all structured around the CMIO categorization, right? So that's the kind of starting point. And then I'm going to talk about how this process of racialization, which is supposed to ensure a kind of racial harmony, is not always, doesn't always result in equal outcomes for everyone, right? So suggesting that there's everyday discrimination, racism, and privilege in the kind of racial landscape of Singapore. So I'm not, don't get me wrong in terms of, I'm not saying this policy is completely a failure, right? Of course we have, a very good level of racial harmony. We don't have race riots anymore, right? We have a functioning society in that sense. But I'm saying that, there are fractures and fissures that we should take as indicative of, maybe this policy of racialization is not the best way to manage diversity, right? Then I go on to talk about how in the past 10, 15 years, we've had a changing social demographic landscape in Singapore and how this complicates this management of diversity even more. And finally, I talk about how maybe we need a new starting point, right? So moving away from racial harmony and this myth of disharmony as well. So first I'm going to start by giving you some examples, right, of these fissures, these fractures that I was talking about in the kind of racialized landscape of Singapore, right? So this is one example that we've seen get some media attention, but I think that there are loads of unspoken forms of everyday discrimination that take place, right? So, for example, if you open the newspapers, you'll see that for a lot of jobs they require people with Mandarin speakers, right? So on one hand, that's fair because your customer base might be, Mandarin speaking, you might need a Mandarin speaker, but this also creates an unfair, non-meritocratic landscape, right? Because it's not about necessarily equal opportunity, but privilege is one racial group because we have a policy in Singapore where if you're Chinese, you learn Mandarin in hiring policies, right? So, and sometimes even though you speak Mandarin, because you maybe don't look Chinese, you're biracial, mixed race, you still might not get the job, right? So one example. This example is a recent one, and for those of you who don't know, so that woman up there, she was Miss Singapore Universe, or Miss Singapore World, I think Miss Singapore Universe 2014, right? And for the first time in like over 20 years, Miss Singapore Universe was an Indian Singaporean, right? And visibly so, right? She is a dark-skinned woman, right? And there was a bit of online kind of abuse of the fact that the Indian Singaporean was chosen to represent Singapore in Miss Universe, right? So questioning in some ways whether or not a racial minority could be representative of all of Singapore, right? The issue of skin color is not something, and racial discrimination based on skin color is not something that's unique to Singapore, of course, and neither is racial discrimination in general, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that the myth of racial disharmony has led to particular racialization policies that supposedly create a kind of equal playing field for everyone, but this may not necessarily be true. Okay, so I'm giving you examples of how this may not necessarily be true. And so also this month, I think it's Elle magazine, or one of the big women's magazines in Singapore, right? She appears on the cover. And at a talk last week, the CEO, the editor, right, in chief of Elle magazine, was saying how she got a lot of flack for putting a dark-skinned woman on the cover, and she had to sit in to make sure that she wasn't photoshopped to look lighter skinned, right? So again, this kind of discrimination based on observable physical difference is also still very much apparent, right, in Singapore today. So this example is from a website that's getting a bit of following. So a lot of my students know about it, so young Singaporeans are following this. And it's called, it basically talks about this idea of Chinese privilege, right? And this idea of racial privilege comes from the idea of white privilege, right? So the idea of white privilege is quite widespread and spoken about in North America, for example. And some of the exchanges on this website take place between a Singaporean Indian woman and a Singaporean Chinese woman, right? And so this is one of her posts, and feel free to go have a look at the posts, right? They're pretty well written. And so this Singaporean Chinese woman who posted this post, she talks about how when she posted about her experiences of being a minority overseas, right? She was studying overseas, she works overseas. When she posted about her experiences of being a Chinese minority overseas and discrimination she faced, she got a lot of support from Singaporeans, right? Saying, oh yeah, when I travel overseas too, I faced a lot of discrimination. But similarly, when her counterpart, Indian Singaporean woman, posted about how she faces discrimination in Singapore for being a Singaporean, for being an Indian woman, she actually got a lot of flack from Singaporeans saying, are you being racist? What are you talking about? So not kind of getting that same acknowledgement of her racial marginalization as her fellow Singaporean did, right? And this in itself is what she's talking about in terms of privilege, right? And privilege is something that often goes, it's unacknowledged, or it's unconscious actually. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that this creates a kind of unequal landscape, especially for racial minorities in Singapore, right? So again, is this model, the CMI model of managing diversity, is that valid? Or is that, does that work to the extent to which we want it to work, right? Does it create the kind of social environment that is beneficial for all of us, right? So that's one point that I want you to keep in mind. And so part of that privilege is also linguistic privilege, right? So this is from a student at my university, NTU, And in this post, he talks about how he's watching a countdown show, right, on Channel 5. So Channel 5 is not supposedly a channel that's English language channel, right, caters for all Singaporeans. He's watching a countdown show on Channel 5, and he's saying, he says the countdown is, it's a Taiwanese, I think, artist, and the countdown is being done in Mandarin, right? And he's like, hang on a minute, what's going on, right? Why is this, this is like New Year's Eve countdown, it's on Channel 5, and why is the countdown being done in Mandarin, right? How come this language is seen as one that is accessible to all Singaporeans, right? When we know that Singapore is a multiracial society, right? So again, this is one form of privilege that he writes about, and increasingly, I think, for me as well, for me especially since I do research on diversity and multiculturalism, there's a lot of increasing discourse around this issue of privilege, right, in one way or another. So again, I think these, to me, point to the fissures and cracks in this seemingly equal multiracial landscape, right? Then I want to suggest, but then I want you to think about how the social demographic landscape of Singapore is changing, right? So we have this existing diversity, right, in Singapore. It's a very multiracial society. But in addition to this existing diversity, in the past 15 years, we've seen a lot of migration, right? So this has been talked about a lot, the immigration issue in Singapore. So immigration in terms of new citizens, people getting citizenship and permanent residency, but also we have a large number of non-permanent residents, right? So people on employment pass and the different, work permits. So for those of you who don't know, employment pass is the skilled migrants, and work permits are for low-skilled migrants, simply low-skilled migrants, so construction workers, domestic workers, right? And as you can see, the numbers are quite large, right? So 1.3 million out of 5.4 million total population of Singapore is temporary, right? They're migrant workers. So again, I think this complicates the landscape, right? So we know that out of this category, the large proportion of them are work permit holders. So the total number of work permit holders are almost 1 million, right? And we know out of this category, a large proportion are from South Asia, so India, Bangladesh, but also from Burma, from Thailand, from China, right? And the domestic worker categories are also quite diverse, right? So again, this adds, even another layer to the diversity landscape, right? So that's the temporary migrant population. And then this is a graph that shows you how, so the point I want to make out of this is that 23% of citizens and PRs in Singapore, so this is the more permanent population, right? We saw the temporary resident population, this is the more permanent population. And out of this group as well, 23% are foreign born, right? So, and this is significant. Why? Because again, I think this is indicative of a different measure or different vector of difference, right? Rather than thinking in racial terms, this is another vector of difference. So we have temporary population, we have more permanent residents, we have foreign born, local born. So, starting to think about different vectors of difference, right? And how this creates a different type of landscape to the one which is marked by CMIO categories, right? And I put this slide up because what I want to show from this is that, so this is the change in the ethnic composition of Singaporeans and PRs in 2000 and 2010. And now of course it's 2015, and I think the composition hasn't changed very much, right? So there's been a little bit of shift. There are 2% more Indians and 2% less Chinese proportion of the population. But generally we can see that, the proportions remain the same, right? So in that sense, why should we have, in that sense, shouldn't the racial kind of landscape, shouldn't it remain the same as well, right? I mean, shouldn't the the ways of dealing with diversity remain the same, right? Because the ethnic compositions are the same. If this model has worked before, shouldn't it still be working, right? And this is of course not taking into account the temporary resident population that I showed you before, right? So, but despite this maintenance of the ethnic ratios, what we all know and what we've seen in the popular media especially is there's a climate of increasing xenophobia, right, towards foreigners. And this has been also expressed in like protests against the white population white paper, for instance, but also in very everyday forms, right? Like this. I mean, on one hand, we shouldn't take this stuff seriously, right? Because, you know, this is like non-representative, I think, of the Singaporean population, right? It's a kind of vocal minority in some ways. But in other ways, I think it's indicative of kind of more widespread discomfort or intolerance maybe, or, you know, yeah, I think discomfort is the right word, right? With this influx of the migrant population, right? And so for me, what's interesting here is this word foreign, right? Foreign woman, foreign neighbors. That article referred to Filipino neighbors, and this supposedly refers to that foreign woman sitting there. You know, we can guess or assume that she's East Asian, right? Again here, foreign parents, foreigner on reserve seat. And these foreigners, in some ways, how do we know that they're foreigners, right? If you just saw their picture, I mean, could you really tell that they were foreigners? They're foreigners because of the way they behave, right? Because of, well, partly because of the way they behave, but maybe some ways we can tell that they're foreigners as well. But they're not of different ethnic groups, is my point, right? So, going back to the earlier slide, these foreigners, you know, they haven't changed the ethnic balance, right? They sort of fitted into the existing CMIO policies, but how come the CMIO policies of, you know, racial harmony don't work anymore, right? How come we're still, you know, how come there's this climate of xenophobia, right, that's expressed in, you know, in these kind of everyday forms, but also in more significant ways, you know, at the elections, at the public protests. So again, bearing that in mind, another point I want to make is also the even within these, so that we have the CMIO categorizations, right? And what I showed before perhaps indicates an increasing divide between locals and foreigners, right? So people have said, okay, now the new divide is not between the biggest divides in society are not racial divides anymore, right? The divides between Singaporeans or local born and foreigners, right? So, but what I want to suggest is that, you know, these divides or these differences are not so easy to demarcate anymore, right? And I took this from the Straits Times as a way to talk about this, right? Of course, we have other examples, and in my research as well, people tell me, you know, I can't tell sometimes, you know, is this person Singaporean? Are they a foreign worker? Are they, you know, local born? So again, these lines, these categorizations are becoming blurred, right? So, so what I want to suggest, and what you know, I hope to hear from all of you about is, I think we need a new starting point, right? We need a new starting point in thinking about diversity. I think the CMIO model does not work anymore, and in some ways, you know, it kind of obfuscates the fissures within the CMIO categories as well. And one way in which we can think of a new starting point is to think beyond racial categories, right? So one way, so this incident I'm sure you all know about. So this was a reaction to the, there was an incident, right, that was reported quite widely. So for those of you who don't know, there was an Singaporean Indian family who were cooking curry, and their neighbors who were migrant Chinese family were complaining about the curry smell, right? So, and the reaction, this was mediated at the local level by a local mediator, and the Singaporean Indian family said, okay, we will only cook curry curry when this foreign Chinese family is out. So as a reaction to this, right, Singaporeans, there was a general kind of, this was part of the, you could see this as part of the anti-foreigner sentiment, right? And so Singaporeans came together and said, what, curry is something we all eat, it's our national dish or something, so let's have a cooked curry day, right? And this was celebrated as a way in which the divisions between the CMIO categories disappeared, and we came together as Singaporeans, right? So it's a kind of rise of Singaporean nationalism or Singaporean identity against this migrant other, right? And I think this is in one way we can, we could suggest that, okay, this is the new way of managing diversity, Singaporeans versus others, right? But I don't think that's the answer, right? I don't think that's the new model. So CMIO replaced by local versus foreign, I don't think that's the answer, right? And why do I say this? I say this because I think this is just one way in which community or affinity is being expressed, right? But I think that the landscape has become far more complicated, right? What we also see, for example, are where locals and foreigners do connect, right? In a variety of ways, even across class lines, right? And so the last example I'm going to give you is, this is an example of a project done by a friend of mine and her sister, right? And this is just one example of how local versus foreigner boundaries are crossed, but also class boundaries, right? So, and you may say that this is just anecdotal, but there is, I think, and also this is quite coming across in the research that I do, there's a kind of widespread middle-class sympathy, right, for a lot of low-wage migrant workers in Singapore. So I think to say the local-foreigner divide is the way in which now the new divided society that's replacing CMIO, I think that's false, right? So this, for example, is one way in which class boundaries and the local foreigner boundaries are crossed. Other examples we can think of are, so 30% of Singaporean marriages are now to foreigners, right? That's a key way as well, I think, that that we can counter this local versus foreigner discourse when 30, and I think now maybe even 40% of all new marriages are to foreigners, right? So 4 in every 10 marriages are to foreigners. So what does that again tell us about the new kind of affinities, right, that we're seeing produced? I think there's also a large working class or a class consciousness developing, right, in Singapore as a result of increasing polarizing class divides in Singapore as well. So what I want to end off with and to suggest is that all models of, they're based on this myth of racial disharmony. So the CMIO model as a way to manage diversity, because if it's not managed, then we will have, racial riots or disharmony. I think that that model doesn't work anymore, right? It doesn't address the realities on the ground. And I think what we need to do is start from a new starting point that's not based on disharmony or a fear of difference, but maybe one that's based on a sense of cooperation and conviviality or points of affinity, right? And that do not fall easily into local versus foreigner or Indian versus Chinese kind of boundaries. So I'll stop there and maybe we can continue questions.